Manish, Gurpratap no unmute karo.
Yeah, I can unmute. I unmuted myself, so that's fine. That's fine. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session by Majha House. As you all know, that the last few sessions which happened in August were all dedicated to the month of freedom, and we centered all our themes of our sessions, online sessions, towards on freedom and what it means to be free in today's India. Today is the last session that we have in this series, which we called Azadi Ki Chhaaw Mein. And we have 5 wonderful people joining us today who will be in conversation with Sanjoy Hazarika. Now, today's session is centered around the partitions that took place in Northeast and in Bengal. Living in North India, as I do in Punjab, and some of you others also live in Punjab, when we talk about partition, the only partition that comes to our mind is the partition of Punjab.
जो है जारिका क्यों?
May I request all of you to please switch off your audios except the speakers? Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. So I was talking about I was talking about the partition that comes to the mind foremost, and that is the partition of Punjab, out of which Pakistan was carved out. And somehow we tend to forget, which is rather unfortunate, that 2 other partitions took place in Bengal and in the Northeast. Now, the pain of partition remains the same for everyone. Anyone who undergoes this kind of trauma feels the same kind of anguish and pain, and still there is the element of hope. We have voices from Punjab, and we also have voices from the Northeast and the Bengal. And today, we bring to you these voices that have never been silent about the partitions that took place there. And they will be sharing their memories, their poetry, their literature that is concerned with the partition of the Northeast and Bengal. I have had the good fortune of meeting 3 of the speakers today. I met them at Majha House. I have had the fortune of meeting Sanjoy Hazarika, Enakshi, and Shalin. And I'm delighted to be in touch with Binayak Datta, Samrat, and Amrita. I welcome all of you today here, and thank you on behalf of Majha House for joining us today. And all of you will be in conversation with Sanjoy Hazarika, who will be introducing all of you later on. Now, Sanjoy Hazarika is currently the International Director of the Commonwealth Rights Initiative, that is CHRI, New Delhi, which has offices in London, Accra, and has ECOSOC status. Mr. Hazarika anchors the South Asia Media Defenders Network and is a human rights activist, columnist, and an award-winning former reporter with the New York Times. He is the author of several books, including most recently, Strangers No More, New Narratives from the Northeast. Mr. Hazarika was the founder director of the Center for Northeast Studies and Policy Research at Jamia Millia Islamia. He pioneered the unique boat clinics initiative on the Brahmaputra River in Assam, Northeast India, which has reached 2 million people with health care. He was a member of the Justice Jeevan Reddy Committee to review the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and a former member of the National Security Advisory Board. In addition to being a commentator, he also has made more than a dozen films on rights and conflict, including on Mizoram, Nagaland, and Assam, as well as one on the endangered Gangetic dolphins of the Brahmaputra. So Sanjoy is today in conversation with our 6 speakers today, and I'm pretty sure that we'll have a wonderful, wonderful program, provided you keep all your audios off all the time until we request you to do so during the Q&A session. Thank you so much, and over to you, Sanjoy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gupta, for that introduction. I want to thank Preeti and Ravinder and Majha House for this opportunity to bring in again some of the issues of the Northeast to the Northeast, to the Northwest and the rest of India. To those of you who are overseas across geographies, a connect to the Northeast has always been a part of Majha House's celebration of the creative, the literary, of music and otherwise. Before I introduce our very distinguished and fine speakers today, I want to talk a little bit about the theme of partition and freedom. Partition of India's Northwest and West is well known and documented. There are many plays, there are great poems, great histories and plays which have been written and created. And it's still a lingering, as Gupta mentioned, it's a lingering issue that remains in many hearts and minds. The eastern segment is also reasonably well documented, but less known and not as well researched. But as far as the northeast, the area we call the northeast is concerned, and its connect to partition, it's even less known, less documented and explained. Yet it is critical to the idea of India and in a larger sense of South Asia. Today, our panelists in prose, art, and poetry will walk us through these bylanes of a lesser known history. The partition of India was tested and tried 42 years before Cyril Radcliffe drew his line with the 1905 partition of Bengal. And before partition in August 1947, the district of Assam, Sylhet, through a referendum, perhaps among the few referendums that India has seen, chose to go to East Pakistan. That was the first part of the vivisection. Like Bengal in Assam, like Bengal in the Punjab, a part of Assam too was sliced away. And there were those who refused to be part of the Union of India, whose successors are still battling for their idea of a separate homeland, the Nagas. And there are many legacies also past partition. For the people of Manipur, the decision by India to hand over the most fertile patch of the state to Burma without consultation, the Kabo Valley, remains a deeply divisive issue where New Delhi, and especially Jawaharlal Nehru, is blamed. I don't know if the chat box or the system here has a hand system, but I want to ask a question. I want to start this discussion with a question. How many of you, apart from the panelists, have heard of Gopinath Bordoloi? If there is a hand, please put it in or just say yes or no in the chat box. And Manish will help us do the aggregate in the end. Bordoloi was the premier of undivided Assam in undivided India, and his role was critical for the shape and unity of India. One could even argue that the primary reason why Assam, and to a larger degree, the rest of what we call the Northeast, are in India is because Bordoloi and the Congress colleagues of that time rose in revolt against the Congress High Command, against Nehru and Patel, and allied with Mahatma Gandhi against the Cabinet Mission Plan, which sought to create a constituent assembly that was based on groups and sections. May I request everybody to please switch off your audio? There are a couple of people who, I see Nidhi's iPhone. Several provinces were to be lumped together. Thus, Bengal with Assam and the legislatures with more votes would essentially be able to draw up the constitution of smaller states. And Bengal at that time was then dominated by the Muslim League. And an early morning talk at Noakhali, which was in the throes of riots, Gandhi said to Bordoloi's emissaries the following: I have said that not only a province, but even an individual can rebel against the Congress, and by doing so, to save it, assuming he is on the right. If Assam keeps quiet, it is finished. No one can force Assam to do what it does not want to do. It must become fully independent and autonomous. For the independence of India, it is the only condition. Each unit must be able to decide and act for itself. Assam should not, he said, go into the Constituent Assembly and instead lodge its protest and retire from the Constituent Assembly. Earlier, very furious, Jawaharlal Nehru had told Bordoloi that Assam could not hold up the progress of India. But the Assam leader and his colleagues stood their ground, and facing resistance and confrontation, the Cabinet Mission Plan fell apart, as did the Muslim League effort. But that was not the end of the story. In April 46, 4 months after Gandhi and the Assam Congress had opposed the cabinet mission plan, the Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, met Jinnah and said that the Muslim League could not expect Assam. And I quote Mountbatten, "In the East, I point out that he would get the most useless part of Bengal without Calcutta. And if I'm sorry, I don't know how the host muted me, but in the East, I pointed out that he would get the most useless part of Bengal without Calcutta, and if he wished it, he could have Sylhet back from Assam." That's a bit of a snapshot of history. I'll now move to our panelists, and we will be having 5 of them. The first is Amrita Gupta Singh, who is an art historian and writer involved in art education, archiving, and cultural management. With her roots in Shillong, her interest is the visual culture of Northeast India. She's documenting its arts practices. She's been an Art Think Fellow, a grantee at the India Foundation for the Art, and a curatorial advisor to the Art First Foundation. Her art writings have been published in books and journals, and her latest essay is forthcoming in 20th Century Indian Art. She is a program director at the Mohile Parikh Center in Mumbai and co-editor at the Partition Studies Quarterly Journal. In fact, 3 of the editors of that journal, Amrita, Binayak, and Samrat, are on this panel. So I'd like Amrita to please start. And one thing before she does is I just need to mention that at least 4 or 5 of us who are on this panel, barring Shaleen, have roots in Shillong. So it's a rather interesting Shillong group that's come together. Thank you. And Amrita, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjayda, for this lovely introduction. Thank you, Preeti, for putting this panel together. It's my pleasure to be here for the first time on the Majha House platform. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. Now, may I request my PowerPoint to be shared, please, on the screen? Yes, thank you. So to quickly say that since I come from a background of art history and visual culture, I will be taking you through 2 iconic artists and their works, and also relate that to nationalism and the construction of nationalist iconography through Bharat Mata. Second. Need my paper. Okay. Now, I will quickly give you an overview of the context I'm talking about. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, nationalist aspirations and the ideology of motherhood intertwined with religious, cultural, and aesthetic domains, a politicization quite unique in colonial Indian history. With the positioning of one's selfhood and identity in opposition to Western rule, motherhood emerged as a domain which colonized subjects could claim as their own. In 1905, Abanindranath Tagore, 1871 to 1951, can we have the second slide, please? Painted the Bharat Mata. And it was in the same year that Viceroy Nathaniel Curzon applied imperial cartography for the reorganization of the northeastern regions of British India. Eastern Bengal and Assam, or the Meghna-Brahmaputra River basin, became one administrative province, with Dhaka as the capital. And this partition led to the division of the Muslim peasantry majority in Eastern Bengal from the Hindu land-owning professionals in Western Bengal. Now, the resistance from Assam to this reorganization in 1905 was both in linguistic and cultural terms. Within the politics of economic expansion of British India into the Northeast, with Calcutta as its capital. Now, we know that the Swadeshi movement has its roots in the anti-partition struggle and was formally proclaimed with the boycott resolution in August 1905 in the Calcutta Town Hall. Now, taking this movement of an expanding nationalism in colonial Bengal, which established an enduring spatial frame for Indian national thought, I explore today the aesthetics and politics of Bharat Mata 1905 and his investment in motherhood, and why motherhood, why the image of the mother became so important. And so we see that the prevalence of the mother cult in Bengal in both its great and little traditions offers us an insight into the mythography of motherhood as a sanction from the religious practices of worshipping the Devi in Hindu Bengal. It also aided in Hinduizing the tone of Indian nationalism while offering a counterpoint to male Occident imperialism. Alongside, one must note that the Muslim League was formed in 1906 in Dhaka to safeguard the rights of Indian Muslims. And apart from Abhinandan's painting, I will look at the image making of Raja Ravi Varma, particularly the Raja Ravi Varma press. Just to contextualize, Raja Ravi Varma came before Abhinandan Tagore, but why his imagery is still pervasive in the Indian public sphere is something that I'll touch upon. Now, Bharat Mata was painted by Abhinandan around the pinnacle of the Swadeshi movement, with the Bengal style representing a break from the prevailing norms of Western academic naturalism, as you see in the work of Raja Ravi Varma, who most of you, who know his work, and implying an alternate spiritual standards of aesthetics. So here we see in this whole context, the binary of Western materialist aesthetics versus an Indian spiritualist, So that binary also came through in this whole process of image making for a nationalist aspiration. And in this, the claims of national authenticity were made for its art, and it was appropriated by the Indian national struggle for liberation from British rule. I quote the art historian who has talked about this painting very succinctly. The young and full-bodied, four-armed ascetic figure holding a sheaf, cloth, palm leaf manuscript, and prayer beads in her hands was read as a nationalist mother goddess bestowing the blessings of food, clothing, learning, and spiritual strength on his children. Considering that the issues that stoked the Swadeshi movement, including dissatisfaction with the agrarian, manufactural, educational, and political policies of the colonial government, and that the segments of the society that the activists sought to bring together under the banner of Swadeshi included landowners, traders, students, and the intelligentsia, the iconography is self-explanatory. Now, Abhinandan Tagore's figure, the Bharat Mata, as you see, is a secular figure. And why is it secular, and what is its sources, and how it was made is something that I'll briefly talk about to understand the processes of image making. Now, Abhinandan was tutored by European painters. E.B. Havel, a British Orientalist, introduced him to late Mughal and Pahari miniature painting. He also came across Irish miniatures. In 1902, Japanese art historian and philosopher of Pan-Asianism, Kazuko Okakura, visited the Tagore household in Jurasako, transporting a direct influence of Japanese aesthetics on Abhinandan. In 1903, Okakura sent two young Japanese painters to the studio, Jurasako studio in Calcutta, to further an intercultural exchange of aesthetic procedures. Now, in the common aesthetic interests of Japonisme, Abhinandan further developed his own wash technique. Now, when you see the painting, you see this whole misty luminosity, and Bharat Mata is not contoured with a map, unlike later popular representations. And also, she seems to be standing on a transcendental plane, somewhere otherworldly kind of a figure. Very, very something that you can look up to. And how did Abhinandan achieve this misty luminosity? So he applied as many as 15 transparent watercolor washes on Watman English, note the English, cartridge paper, allowing the paper to dry and then bathing the painting with a basin of water to achieve the misty luminosity, which he referred as morotai, that is characteristic of his oeuvre. Now, when you look at Abhinandan's painting, the image is against a flat background. This is also something that flatness is also a very Mughal influence, along with the linearity. And he also knew what, because he was tutored in by European tutors, he also knew the drawing of the human figure. But what he is doing, he is cancelling out European oil painting, which is a byproduct of the opium trade. He is looking at watercolors, he's looking at fresco buono, tempera, and a mixing of European and vernacular pigments to complete his works. It is worthwhile to contextualize that Japan had defeated Russia in 1905, and as such provided Bengal, then in the grip of partition rioting, with an ideological resource to fight British influence.
No, she was not ready to.
Hello? Sorry? So now this Bharat Mata was also utilized by a political rally in 1905, enlarged by a Japanese artist and asked in fundraising Swadeshi processions. And the rhetoric sounding it shaped much of its significance. So if Bharat Mata became a central icon to the polemical construct of nationality, it was because of the turn of the political and cultural forces of his time. As a matter of fact, Abhinanath was a selective engagement with modernity through strategic and performative choices based on modern constructions of an Indian classicism which is also Mughal, a pan-Asianism of Japanese origin, and a regional and local cultural history. Now, when Abhinanath painted his work, he called it Bongo Mata referring to the two Bengals, and it was not Bharat Mata. Now, later, when it was appropriated in the national struggle, it became Bharat Mata. So Bongo Mata, in a way, was representative of a unified regional linguistic community of Eastern and Western Bengal. It served as a local and regional cultural consciousness, and prior to nationalized communal politics, the image of the mother goddess had a strong emotional charge to the Hindu and the Muslim alike, equally in Bangladesh also. Now, so we see that what I'm trying to say, that this figure, because of its heterodox sources, the way it was painted, the kind of influences that it had, it is aesthetic secularization that he was pointing at. It is a gentle, it is a lyrical painting, it is a secular figure, and it was not contoured with the map. So the fixity of the map was not projected onto the figure. It was like an imagined kind of open-ended national context that he was kind of looking at. And so although Bharat Mata is considered the most nationalist or political or Swadeshi painting, not only of Abhinanath, but of the period, it was actually modeled after something very personal, that is the face of his daughter. Now, I will come to the third, if you could go to the third slide, please. Now, I will briefly discuss Ravi Varma. And Ravi Varma was an artist who came before Abhinanath Thakur, as you see, 1840 to 1906, but he is credited with many firsts. So I'll quote: the first Indian artist to master perspective and the use of the oil medium, the first to use human models to illustrate Hindu goddesses and gods, the first Indian artist to become famous. Before him, painters and craftsmen were largely identified, and the first to make his work available, not just to reach elite, but also to the common people by way of his oleographs. So the first figure that you see in the third slide is an oleograph from the Raja Ravi Varma Press, which was started in Bombay in 1894. A carefully chosen location for the expediency of importing machinery from Germany and distributing the prints. Now, the Ravi Varma Press became the foremost printing establishment in the Bombay region and continued to be so till it was burnt down in 1972. And the foremost printmaker who took care of his press was a German printmaker. Now, so the period of production of Ravi Varma's oleographs also coincided with Calcutta as a rapidly urban center, politically and culturally, the print medium becoming a source of wide circulation of images for nationalist aspirations, the Indian freedom struggle using Ravi Varma's prints, the kind of work that was going on for their own rallies and all of that. And also corresponding in Western India, Bombay and Pune emerged as two major centers for mass print production. Now, what we see is, why does Ravi Varma's work, why does his figure become so pervasive in the Indian public sphere? And largely Abaninath's work goes back into, the art historical context and Indian art historical context and all of that. But Ravi Varma, mass production, mass outreach, and with the Ravi Varma Press being alive till 1972, it marks for the kind of image making, colonial image making that is part of what we still see today. So it was a hybrid Indo-Renaissance style. And in a sense, the popular grew hand in hand with the national, and the printed icon was an important vehicle for the dissemination of national aspirations. So you see why the goddess figure, it is related to the common paper, it is naturalistic, the way you look sitting in front of me, three-dimensional. So what you see in the first oleograph of Ravi Varma is that, the mother goddess or the Hind Mata is standing against a lion, a symbol of ferocity and all of that. But it's also against a landscape. It could be a mythical landscape. But when you see, go to the next image of a book, of a print on the book by Sumati Ramaswamy. There you see the Bharat Mata figure, being fixed within a map. So the geo body and the national body sort of comes, very, very close to each other. And then you see even the kind of representation in sculptural form in the statue in Kanyakumari. It is very close to the Ravi Varma's iconography. And also, if you see on the right-hand side bottom, there also you will see the similarities, and also a much more strident Bharat Mata, which is a far cry from Abhinandan's gentle lyrical figure. And also a far cry from Ravi Varma's print of the mother figure. Even if she's standing in front of a lion, she doesn't look, threatening. But the right edge, the last image that you see, the rectangular figure, is a strident mother Bharat Mata, which is also, sort of responds or sort of is representative of our current times. A very strident, a very Hindu, a very strong Hindutva kind of a figure, and it is largely used by people who want to use it in the way they want to. And I also want to sort of point out that this kind of iconography of Raji Varma's iconography was also used in August 5th, Ayodhya, as a backdrop, as a part of the decor. So it is sort of, what I'm trying to point out is the form of colonial image making is more important than forms of kind of secular kind of imagery that I see in Abhinandan Thakur. Now, quickly going back to the context of the Northeast, back to Bengal, and back to how Bongo Mata. Quickly dwell on how Bongo Mata and Bharat Mata was co-opted within the regional context of the 1905 partition, which conflated spatial and conflict and economic inequity in India. It was both an expansion of imperial space and the establishment of a distinctively Indian national space that emerged for the first time between 1870 to 1914 inside Britain's imperial globalization. If Muslims in East Bengal welcomed this partition as a way to secure economic opportunities, the elite Bhadraloks in West Bengal filed petitions against the severance, expressing a disregard for wider inclusiveness. Separating the latter from the progressive, flourishing, and culture districts of Dhaka and Maimanching, along with the Chittagong districts, the annexation to sort of this construct of the Northeast as backward, underdeveloped province like Assam, defined common sense for these petitioners. And this elite petition also felt the two Bengals share a common linguistic and cultural heritage, and the land beyond the Meghna was what of wild aboriginal races. So they sort of tried to reclaim a national homeland that alienated Assam. So if the Swadeshi movement confronted British imperial privilege, it also valorized a united Bengal, positioning Calcutta over Dhaka, and isolating colonial Assam and the centers of Shillong and its centers of Shillong and Guwahati. And we see, as we sort of see the kind of unfolding of territorial politics into the events of 1947, the later 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War is deeply rooted to the spatial inequalities and political interests of 1905. And we also see that while the territorial longing for united Bengal still inflects academic and cultural discourse, and we also know of Assam's claim for its own motherland through the Assam movement has had a lasting impact on the shaping of contemporary regional politics in the Northeast. And the various ethno-nationalism that erupted in Northeast India in 1947 has its roots in an antipathy towards an Indic identity and an Indian national space. So the migrations that the partition perpetuated through these with Bangladesh is still active. The rhetoric of settlers, outsiders has given rise to a complicated combination they now see and see in Northeast India. And with the current regime's attempts of Hinduizing democracy and altering the concept of citizenship, Bharat Mata stand at crossroads in the 21st century. And I would also like to refer to a very important point that Samrat has pointed out in one of his articles, where in a way, the whole circle of Hinduizing democracy or Hinduizing nationalism from the partition that we see comes full circle in if you kind of join it to what has happened on August 5th in Ayodhya. With that, I close my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrita, for that very, very different and unique approach to a very fascinating part of our history. You know, bringing in Raja Ram Varma from his, and his art as well as the work that you've studied, and it was really interesting to see Gandhi, Bose, Nehru and Patel along with Bharat Mata. I mean, in these times, it's rather, shall we say unique, and rather against the trend, but that was nearly a century ago. But thank you for that. We'll get back to you later. I want to actually go to Samrat. Samrat was actually supposed to be the first speaker, but for some reason, I managed to skip him, and I want to go back to him really now. He's author and a journalist, and most recently co-author with Preeti Gill of Insider Outsider, a book which talks about belonging and unbelonging in Northeast India. Living between Shillong and Calcutta, he's been an editor for several papers. He's a contributing writer to a number of magazines and newspapers, and was the 2018 Asian Leadership Fellow from India at the International House of Japan in Tokyo, and along with Amrita and Vinayak Datta is a co-editor of the Partition Studies Quarterly Journal. So Samrat, you're on.
Thank you, Sanjay. Lacking expertise in any topic, because after all, I'm a journalist. So I'll stick to talking about subject I know a little more about, hopefully, which is myself and my ignorance about the topic of partition. So we are talking today about partition in the East, the forgotten stories. And of course, the story of partition in the Northeast as a whole is forgotten, but I think broadly, for perhaps most of the country, most people in the country, and most people around the world, partition in the East as a whole is more or less forgotten. It might be remembered that it happened, but beyond the fact that it happened, I don't think we remember too much. And by saying we, I include even people like myself, whose family on both my father's and my mother's side were directly affected by partition. Because growing up, actually, we didn't really hear anything about it. And once in a while, there might be some little bit of nostalgia which sort of popped out about the Desher Bari, which was so wonderful, the house back in the country which was left behind. And it would sort of emerge that this terrible event had happened because of some arch villain called Jinnah, and because of the equally villainous Angrez. But how and why this happened And how the whole thing came to pass was something that remained a bit of a mystery. Now, growing up in Shillong in the 1980s and early 90s, I think we had more immediate problems to deal with because we had to deal with the question of our sort of belonging there. We grew up with riots and an insurgency, and a lot of it had to do with us being sort of unwelcome outsiders there, at least the rioting part of it. And so we had more immediate concerns. Now, our history books didn't really tell us anything. As far as I can recall, I think our history sort of started with the great golden age of the Mauryas and the Guptas, and then there was various golden ages in between, and then it sort of peters out with Aurangzeb, or maybe it was Bahadur Shah Zafar, I don't remember now, and that's where our history ended. So the whole thing about independence and the freedom struggle and partition and all of that, those difficult, more immediate, contentious topics were left completely untouched. After that, I studied science and engineering, and then I worked as a journalist in Delhi, Bombay, and Bangalore. And of course, I remained blissfully ignorant about partition and what it might have to do with our lives at present. In fact, I still remember, maybe it was 2005 or so, and I remember telling, of all people, Urvashi Butalia, who's done sterling work on partition in Delhi, that no, people of our generation and younger people, we don't really care about partition. It's history, it's over. It's something that older people used to worry about, and we've moved on. And I think it took several years. It took about a decade for me to realize that I was wrong. And I realized it when I started going back to Assam and Meghalaya from Bombay, because I was working on a non-fiction book which had nothing to do with partition. But I had to confront a question which had dogged me right through my childhood in Shillong. And the question, often unasked, but often implicit, was, why are you here? And this was a question that I thought that I sort of faced and that people like me probably faced. And I had to answer that question. Why were we there? The only way to answer that question was actually to go back to partition, because that's why we were there. That's how we came to be there. That's how my ancestors came to be there. And so I began to engage a little more with the topic. And then I moved back to Shillong and I met Binayak, who's a historian and a scholar of partition studies. And we had many conversations and we sort of ended up, Amrita, Binayak, and I started doing this thing called Partition Studies Quarterly. So I've had occasion to engage a little more with the topic. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a historian, and so I've just picked up a few tidbits about this forgotten history of partition in the Northeast. And I think one of the first surprises that came to me was a part of the bigger picture, something that you mentioned in your opening remarks, which was something to do with the cabinet mission plan. And I had, of course, never heard of it. And I was surprised to discover that until 1946, the British were not quite trying to divide and rule and leave a divided India. They seemed at least to be trying to leave a united India. And it seemed from that, from whatever little I read about that plan, that they came very close to succeeding in leaving a sort of some kind of federal but undivided India. And of course, there would have been many problems. For example, Assam would have been shortchanged by that process, but it did come close to succeeding because both the Muslim League and the Congress initially agreed with the proposal. Until in July 1946, Nehru gave a press conference or maybe a press interview, I'm not sure which, I don't remember which, in which he went back on it. And that sparked off a chain of events, because then Jinnah called for direct action, and then direct action day happened the following month here in Calcutta, and there were riots. And after that, riots broke out in other places, and partition became an inevitability. But it was interesting for me to discover that even after that chain of events, even after the riots, there were efforts to prevent the partition of Bengal. And I was surprised to discover something which historians probably know, it's been written about at length, which was the United Bengal plan of Hussein Surahwardi and Sarat Bose, who was Subhash Bose's brother, and a successful politician in his own right, and which was basically to have a united and independent Bengal. And they seem to have come fairly close to succeeding in that, because last year at the British Library in London, I found a letter written by Hussein Surahwardi to Sir Eric Neville, who was the private secretary to Lord Mountbatten. And the date was 31st of May 1947, which is basically 2.5 months before partition actually happened. And he's sort of writing this letter where you can tell that he's been talking to Mountbatten and he's not quite kept Jinnah in the loop. And he's worked out some kind of deal which he seems to believe is a done deal. And he seems to believe that basically he's going to get his united and independent Bengal, and his only query at that point to Sir Eric Neville in his letter is about how to get Bengal into the Commonwealth. So it was a bit of a surprise, of course, a very interesting one. And at that point, it seems that the same groups which had earlier, the same classes and caste combinations probably, which had earlier in 1905 fought hardest against the first partition of Bengal, had by 1947 changed their minds. And so it was the Hindu Mahasabha led by Shama Prasad Mukherjee and the Bengal parts of the Congress in Bengal, which seem to have supported the idea of partitioning Bengal and creating a West Bengal to, as it were, save the whole thing from becoming a Muslim-dominated place. And so at that point in time, the business interests and the upper caste interests coalesced on the same side. The Dalit voice at that time, their most prominent leader was Jogendranath Mandal, who famously became the first law minister of Pakistan and remained in Pakistan, in East Pakistan until 1950 or thereabouts, when he was forced to leave and move to India. So these stories are known to historians, I suppose, but I wonder if they're known to the broader public, wider public. And I think that in the point in our history where we are at, it might be useful to remember some of these things, these ideas which were discussed and talked about at that point of time, and not with any sense of sort of revisionism or historical revenge, because unfortunately the study of partition tends to evoke strong passions, but merely with a sense of understanding that there were many strands and many threads to the story. So I see that there are still connections with the present and with understanding issues like NRC and Citizenship Amendment Act, and with understanding why many of us who are here. And so that's what we are trying to do actually. That's what I'm trying to do these days. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Samrat. You're exactly on time, and I thank you for that. You know, we have three more speakers, and I'm conscious of the time and also of the fact that we need to give time to the audience to interact with the panelists. So I'm going to go straight now to Shalim, who is a poet apart from many other things. Shalim is, let me just get this right. I'll introduce him very briefly. He's also a translator and researcher based between Delhi and Guwahati. He's living in Guwahati now, and was the Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow at Wales, 2019 to 20. And his first book of poems, Beetlenut City, won the RL Poetry Prize in 2017. It was published in 2019. His translation of Kamal Kumar Tati's post-colonial poems was published the same year, that's 2019. And his translation of Mia poems, which is a new genre of writing in Assam, which has led to a bit of controversy, is scheduled for publication in November this year by Speaking Tiger Books, and is completing his first work of fiction. So, Shalim, over to you.
Good evening. Thank you, Sanjay, Priti, and the Majha House team. I'll read two poems today. Both the poems were written in 2016. They were written after a visit to a locality in Assam, in the Gwalpara district of Assam, called Golokganj, in two villages which border, which are located on the India-Pakistan border, on the Indian side. So in 2016, when I went there, there were a number of families from these two villages whose names unfortunately didn't appear, who were declared D-voters. And they were furious about it because they were claiming that they had lived in that same location for as many generations as they could remember. So they claimed that they were original inhabitants of that place. So when I went there, I interacted with a large number of people, and most of them told me that before the border was constructed, they lived on plots of land currently on the Bangladesh side of the border, and they had to give up those lands and move into the Indian side when the border was constructed. They moved twice, in fact. First, when the temporary border was made, and once again when the fenced border was put up. So these poems are titled Golokganj 1 and Golokganj 2. Golokganj 1. After a long ride down a road newly raised and porcupined against the river, we unload our cameras on a rice field, half India, half immigrant. It's 2 weeks past the 26th of January, and they're celebrating. The rain came first, and let me tell you, it was cold, cold. We had to postpone the Republic. His lungi is muddy, his ganji crusted with sweat. Looks like the map of Bangladesh, he laughs, then asks if the camera is on. I stand on the raised border, two endless lines of concertina, 4 strings on each line, the space in between heaped with more coiled wire. I wonder, but don't ask if they're electrified. The border policeman on his bicycle stops, eats his lunch on the grass. He has never cycled across the lines. The air from the other side, filtered through the metal screen, should, but doesn't smell different. I had more expectations from my first international border, I guess. There on that raised mound, where 4 lines of betelnut trees mark a rectangle and still ripen every March, inside that was home. Our phones still catch the signal from the other side. He feeds us country chicken and fish. We sit on his wife's furniture, 5 years old, but the varnish still glossy. The false seal old sari could have been mother's. and the door I lean against looks old, so old that it could be the last remnant of the house across the lines. Thank you. Golokganj 2. This is about one of the women whose names were included in the D category. So they had lost their rights to vote. And this is a woman who had lost her memory and most of her family, so she didn't have anyone to depend on, and she was petrified that they would take her and throw her across the border. She was almost 90 years old, half blind. Golokganj 2. After the country chicken, the country woman comes pecking at the front door. She leaves her beak on the wall and squats. Her head is shiny. Someone could crack a coconut on her skull or something less auspicious like a police baton. Everyone comes with papers. She comes with history on her palms. Dig deep in the cracks and you will find aged turmeric. When she raises her hands, fish jump from the rivers to the crevasses on her face. When they eventually drag her away, her clothes will stretch and like coconut shells in the sun, fall away fiber by fiber. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalim. Very, very poignant, very powerful, as always. I like the line. I mean, I liked all of it, but history on her palms is what is written on all of our palms. Let me go now to another historian, Binayak Datta, who is teaches at the Department of History in the Northeast Hill University in Shillong. He's the author of 3 books, including Religion in Politics and co-author of History of the Judiciary in Assam. His main focus of areas of focus are modern India and partition studies, earlier with Assam University, and he's also a visiting fellow at the Umi Kumar Das Institute for Social Change and Development, Guwahati, and is the author of numerous articles in national and international journals. So, Binayak, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjayda. Thank you so much, Majha House, Preeti Gill, Samrat, for actually, helping us, and of course, Amrita. Partition of India, as the introducer, the first person who's introduced us, it invariably comes to us as a partition of Punjab. By the 1970s, 1980s, it dawns on us that there is, of course, another side, and that's Bengal. And by the end of this, by the end of the century, end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, we kind of realize that, well, there is another site of partition, and that's Northeast India. And the reason why I actually talk about, Northeast India is that, and here I want to congratulate Sanjayda, because in his latest book, he actually writes, what is also not often understood is that the Northeast suffered the impact of not one but 2 partitions. I just want to take the argument a little ahead, Sanjayda, and actually talk about the fact that Northeast is a land that's made by partitions. And if you actually look at the Northeast as we understand, it's a process of partition that actually starts off in 1772, when the English East India Company decides to actually separate the Khasi Jaintia areas of the hills from the Khasi Jaintia areas of the plains, and where the English East India Company takes over those areas of the Khasi Jaintia people, which are located within what is understood as Sylhet, the plains of Sylhet. So that's the beginning of partition. And, so in that sense, Northeast has had a very prolonged partition, something which is not, which is very different from either Punjab or even Bengal. I mean, if you trace the history of partition of Bengal to say 1905, I think I want to trace the history of partition of Northeast India right up from 1772 onwards. Having said that, Sanjayda talks about 2 partitions, the partition of Burma and the partition of 1947. I want to take the argument a little ahead, and I want to essentially say that while on the one hand we actually see the partition, the drawing of a border, which is also known as the Maxwell-Johnstone border, Pradeep Panjauban has actually a book, The Northeast Question, which is actually devoted to that. But we also probably have to remember that what separates Tibet from India is the McMahon line. So if we are trying to talk about lines, there are many lines actually which make partition. And so therefore partition becomes actually the demarcator that creates Northeast India. That's the first point that I want to flag right at the very beginning. The second point, and I'm really grateful that Sanjay talks about Gopinath Bordoloi and his opposition to the grouping plan. But I want to actually, the cabinet mission comes in February 1946. I want to take, I want to remind myself about what happens in April 1946. In April 1946, Gopinath Bordoloi goes and has a meeting with Lord Wavell, who's then the Viceroy. And he actually tells Wavell that, see, I'm quite willing to, and that's in April 1946. He tells Wavell that I'm quite willing to actually send Sylhet back to Bengal. So basically the idea that, how does partition take place? How does separation take place? Is invariably a very, very complicated question, which is just not about drawing of borders and boundaries. It's not just something that is to be tagged with the other parts of the country like Punjab and Bengal. Because in Northeast India, the question of partition is not only prolonged, it's much more complicated because it's not just a question of religion, it's also the question of ethno-linguistic politics. And this is something that we need to remember because in 1945, when the Assam Pradesh Congress Committee, predominantly the Brahmaputra district dominated committee, comes out with an election manifesto for the elections of 1945. And in that election manifesto, the manifesto very clearly points out that the aim of the Assam Pradesh Congress Committee is to create a homogeneous province of Assam. And it is towards that end of creating a homogeneous province of Assam that Bordoloi goes to Wavell in 1946 and says that, see, I think, okay, we understand we are opposed to the grouping plan, but we are also agreeable at the same time to separate Sylhet, which had come to Assam in 1874, and we are willing to send it back to East Bengal. In that context, I think we also need to remember that partition comes to Northeast India through what is called the referendum. Sanjay has spoken about, given some kind of a hint about the referendum. On the 3rd of June, when Lord Mountbatten actually makes the partition proposals public, what actually he says in the same breath is that if there is a partition in Bengal, then a referendum will be organized in the Bengali-dominated district of Sylhet, which is in South Assam. Mind you, it's unique because a referendum is not unique because referendum takes place not only in Assam, in Sylhet, but it also takes place in Northwestern Frontier Province. And we are aware about that. But what is unique is that Sylhet is a district and the referendum does not take place in Assam. The referendum takes place in one of the districts of Assam, and that too a Bengali-speaking southern district of Assam, namely Sylhet. And so a referendum takes place on the 6th and 7th of July, and that actually drags Assam into the contested politics of partition. And this is very, very important because while we talk about Radcliffe, a man who actually divides India in less than 40 days, we probably need to understand that the partition of Northeast India is something that's a very, very prolonged, detailed process, which is definitely more multi-layered than what we actually see in Punjab and Bengal. And I want to flag this difference because it is only then we need to understand, then we can understand the complexity of this partition. The third important thing is that when we talk about the Radcliffe, report, one of the things that Radcliffe actually points out very, very clearly, and this is actually not true, is that he says that the mandate is essentially that the mandate is essentially to divide the Hindus and the Muslims. But ultimately what happens is that the people who get divided are just not the Hindus and Muslims of Sylhet, because Sylhet was just not a question of Hindus and Muslims. There are a lot of indigenous communities who are also sharing space in Sylhet. And so therefore the Khasis, the Jayantiyas, the Garo, who actually, located themselves across India and what is now Mymensingh in Bangladesh. So therefore, when you start talking about partition of Northeast India, I think it's just, it's a unique situation because we're just not talking about the Hindus and the Muslims. We are also talking about various other indigenous communities who actually find themselves partitioned as a result of what is called the story of partition. Having said that, I think the first step towards partition histories and recovering a comprehensive history of partition histories is to recover Northeast India within this partition history. This is something that is that's very interesting. But what is most interesting is that it is actually a very, very contested and a cultural, it's like a festive moment. You know, if you talk about referendum, one of the things that essentially comes out as a result of partition is that it's not just about negotiations across the table. It's about contests, contests on the ground, and where people are actually singing, songs which are countering each other. So if the Congress, the communists and the Jamiatis who are combining together are actually singing the stories of a composite reality of India, the future, a composite future of India. On the other hand, you have the Muslim League, which is essentially talking about an extremely exclusive idea of a nation state. But what is very, very important is which we invariably fail to flag, and Assam, especially Sylhet, is a classic example, is that while the rest of the country probably were talking about Hindus and Muslims, in Sylhet, we actually see three sets of people who are actually coming together and opposing partition. The Congress, the Jamiatul Ulema-e-Hind, and the communists. And there are a lot of misconceptions about this idea that actually Hindus were supporting unification and Muslims were actually supporting Pakistan. And Sylhet actually is a site which tells us that the story of partition is actually not Hindu and Muslim. It is something much more complex than what it has been made to be. Now, having spoken about the recovery, I want to then talk about the next step. And the next step that I want to talk about is the reference. Now, when I talk about the reference, it's very, very important to see that most of the textbooks in India, established textbooks, which we have used right from our school to the college to the university, do not integrate the partition of Northeast India in our narrative, either consciously or unconsciously. And that is why I think we need to probably point out that our sources of study must not only be essentially archival, but our sources of study must actually be a combination of archival and ground level research. And this is where I think somebody like Samrat is really doing very interesting work. Having said that, I think I want to now refer to the third section. And the third section is partition a dead story? You know, Samrat, when you started off your narrative and you started talking about how a certain conception was there that people, it's a story which is no longer resonant in contemporary times. I think Northeast is a story where we live partition. And this story of partition is a live history. Amrita spoke about it. We know that NRC, when you talk about the NRC, you talk about legacy. And when you talk about legacy, you talk about, the 51, NRC 51. When you talk about NRC 51, you talk about the Census 1951. When you talk about Census 1951, you talk about the Census Act of 1948. When you talk about Census Act of 1948, you talk about partition. So therefore, invariably, we are connected. Our lives now are also connected to partition. And similarly, when we talk about partition in Northeast India, I think it's very, very important to realize that we are still living the paranoia that actually led to the kind of partition histories that we are. This is something that we need to accommodate. I'm very happy that we've heard poetry. In fact, in 1947, when we are trying to talk in terms of partition histories, we actually forget that there is a very live history, cultural history that's associated with partition of Northeast India. On the one hand, you have, for example, I actually remember when I was doing my research, one of the poems that I heard, which one was talking about, a poem from the Muslim League repertoire, which said, "Atti dia mojjid banglo gombujar sin rakhlo na, amra to bhai Asame thakbo na." So the idea is that when we start talking about partition, we have to recognize that we need to integrate Northeastern partition histories into the history of partition in Northeast India. And we also need to understand that it is a definitely more multi-layered and more complex story than what has been understood so far. I think we can continue our discussions. It's a very, very interesting theme. Thank you so much, Majha House, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on partition and Northeast India.
Thank you, Binayak, for that wonderful tour of history for all of us. It's a great learning. It's good to have teachers in a conversation like this. You will find that Guru Pratap himself, of course, is a teacher, and you have one number of others who teach at universities. Raki is online. So all of us are very privileged and happy to have you, and I'm very glad you trace the complexity, like again the palm of our hand, the many lines of the palms of all our hands. I think that's very important. I'm going to come to the last presenter of the evening, and Inakshi Ganguly is also from Shillong, like many of us. She is, of course, the co-founder of HUC, the Center for Child Rights, and a long-time child rights activist who is engaged with governments, international organizations. She's the president of SURTI, is a professor, an honorary professor at the NLU Odisha, and along with me, co-convener of the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN. Very spontaneous and very courageous. So over to you, Inakshi. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Good evening. Thank you, Majha House, for including me in Azadi Ki Chhao Mein. It's almost serendipitous that I should be reading about Sylhet and about being a Sylheti after Binayak's talk. My mother is from Sylhet and my father is from Dhaka. My sister and I are first generation born in India and second generation of East Pakistan. I was born in Shillong and naively believed it was my hometown and that my home state was first Assam and after bifurcation, Meghalaya. I said so to everyone who asked me as I was growing up, never claiming Delhi to be my own. I was always in a state of sort of transition in my head. Delhi did become home till only when I realized that Shillong, that I thought was my home, was only so in my own head. For others, there was an outsider. As Samrat said, confront the question, why are you here? After our parents sold off their dream house in Shillong, built with a loan from my father's provident fund, he said to us, never settle where you're an ethnic minority, raising questions for me as to where do I belong. I was planning to read a text from Tagore, his essay on nationalism this evening, till Sanjay directed me to a piece by Shandipon Deb, my cousin, who is online with us today. His mother and mine are first cousins. Shandipon's maternal grandfather, his Nana or Dadu, was my mother's maternal uncle, her mama. His text resonates with me, and so it was easy for me to make it mine to read. This evening, I'm reading excerpts from his article, My Memories of Partition, written on 15th of August, 2017. Shandipon writes, My memories come entirely from my parents and my grandparents. They saw partition in 1947 and were evicted. They lived the partition and built a new, excuse me. I'm sorry, I'll just begin again. My memories come entirely from my parents and my grandparents. They saw partition in 1947 and were evicted. They lived the partition and built a new life, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to do it. They had no choice. Both my parents were refugees. My father passed away in 2000. Two of my grandparents stayed on for some time in East Pakistan, refusing to believe that everything would be taken away from them. They couldn't grasp that idea. The last few years of his life, when my father was with me for 6 months of the year, we would only argue. We would be angry with each other, and we would go to bed still feeling angry. I would tell him to forget, and he would insist, I remember. What was I asked to remember? I come from Sylhet. I can't speak Sylheti, but I understand the dialect well enough to get by. Sylhet was a thriving town and a district. It had a strong cultural quotient. In the 1930s, it had the highest readership after Calcutta of Prabashi, the leading literary Bengali magazine. The Sylhetis are all over the world now. They are some of the most in-demand cooks on earth. Chances are that in any Indian restaurant that you go to in London, the cooks are Sylheti. Sylhet had a unique role in the story of partition, but the story is not well known. It was the only province from the east where a referendum was held. Do you want to stay with India or go to Pakistan? The pencil drawing the Radcliffe line shook a bit when it came to Sylhet. Radcliffe line. In July 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, flew in Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a college mate of his, to draw the borders between the proposed new India and the proposed new country of Pakistan. Radcliffe was an eminent barrister, but knew nothing about India. He was given 5 weeks to draw up the borders. To help him in his important task, he was given some maps, some data about rivers and population, and an unlimited supply of whiskey. Radcliffe submitted his report and the new maps on 12th of August, 1947, and took the first flight home. He lived for 29 more years, becoming a Viscount, but never again did he visit the Indian subcontinent. To go back to Sylhet, the referendum was held in July 1947, and the ayes for Pakistan won by a razor-thin margin. There were allegations of rigging and bogus votes, but that was only to be expected, whichever side won. Sylhet went to Pakistan, except for a little bit of it, one part of Karimganj subdivision, which was appended to the Indian state of Assam. Karimganj since then has become a district in Assam. My mother's family used to live in Karimganj, while my maternal grandfather looked after his land and property in an area that had now become Pakistan. My father's family had their roots in Habiganj, now a part of Bangladesh, and my paternal grandfather, who had taken early retirement from civil service, had settled in Sylhet town. My father, then 21 years old, had joined the Reserve Bank of India in Calcutta. I grew up listening to, and listened to even as an adult, to my father's memories of loss. Decades after partition, he had not lost his anger about what he had lost. I would often argue with him and perhaps hurt him. I did not want him living in the past. I wanted him to let go, and I was frustrated that he couldn't. The partition was a given fact, and it was time to move on. The only link I had with partition, other than my father's anger, was a strange incomprehension I felt as a child and as a teenager with my classmates, when my classmates told me that they were going to their village or ancestral home for their vacations. I had no such place to go to. We were not allowed there. I grew up in Calcutta, Delhi, Bombay. The apartments, were the only homes I knew. My paternal grandfather could not believe that Sylhet was now part of a Muslim nation called Pakistan. When finally he came to terms with that notion, he refused to leave, even though his daughters and son were living in Calcutta. Even if this is now a Muslim state, All Muslims I know are my neighbors and friends, was his reasoning. This is my house. Why should I leave? When the riots happened in 1950, Hindus were killed, their houses looted and torched, while the Pakistani police looked on benignly. My grandfather suddenly realized that this was not his country anymore. The people did not want him there. He would have to sell his house and go to India. My father went to Sylhet and negotiated a sale of the house. A neighbor bought the house, but when handing over the money, told my father that he was 1,000 rupees short, a fairly large sum then, and that he would be sending the amount very soon. Everyone knew he would never pay up, and he never did. My maternal grandfather stayed on, innocently trusting the Pakistani government. He owned a lot of land and he needed to look after his holdings. He got a rude shock when he was put in prison during the 1965 Indo-Pak War. All well-to-do Hindus were taken into custody. That was when he figured out that he would have to push off too, and he could never get back his land. Once released from jail, he came penniless to Karimganj, where his family had been waiting for him for years. I have read many articles that speak of how resilient the refugees of Pakistan were, how they took charge of their destinies and built their fortunes, and how some of them went to become millionaires and billionaires. The writers of these articles miss a vital point. There was a vast difference between what happened post-partition in Punjab and what happened in Bengal. In Punjab and Delhi, there was an exchange of property between people moving to Pakistan and people coming in from Lahore and Karachi. In Delhi, large swaths of land were given to refugees to build their own homes and start businesses. Prosperous localities like Rajendra Nagar and Lajpat Nagar are testimony to that. Nothing like that happened in Bengal. The only land that the Bengali refugees got was in Delhi, in what is now known as Chittaranjan Park. But all that land went to people who were already in Delhi, and most of them having jobs in the central government. The really needy who crossed the East Pakistan, West Bengal border with whatever they could rescue of their life savings in a bundle that they could carry on their heads got nothing. When I read some people writing that their parents who were refugees never looked back at the past, but looked forward and worked hard to build a new life, I feel disappointment and anger. For the East Bengal refugees, the past was their cursed present, and their future was and proved to be a ghastly plague. Nehru's government did nothing for the Eastern refugees. 1 million of them arrived and had no choice but become squatters in the outskirts of Calcutta. Today, these areas are very much a part of the city. They built shanties and they made do with whatever they could scrape and scrunch. They fought disease and hunger and eked out an apology of a living. The government resettled them in a totally arid Dandakaranya area in what is now Chhattisgarh. These people soon found that they were worse off than those in Calcutta. In 1979, 22 years after partition, hundreds of these refugees traveled to Sundarbans in West Bengal and decided to live there. The state government under Chief Minister Jyoti Basu responded with unheard of brutality. Their food supplies were cut off, and when they tried to come to the mainland, the police opened fire, killing dozens of helpless refugee seekers who wanted nothing more than a life of a little dignity. Afterwards, all these people were forcibly packed into special trains and sent back to where they came from. Amitav Ghosh's novel, The Hungry Tide, provides a deeply researched and heart-rending account of what is known as the Morich Chapi incident. Partition sent Bengal, the most affluent region at the time of independence, to the dogs. Nothing positive has come out of it other than the searing films of Ritwik Khattak, who spent his life grieving over a divided Bengal. And Sylhet, the most cultured of towns where my father spent the first 21 years of his life, is today the hub of obscurantist Islam in Bangladesh. I have never been to Bangladesh and have no intention to. The house that my grandfather built still stands. My cousin from Kolkata, who visited it some years ago, was received with great cordiality by the people who live there now, who insisted that she and her husband stay for dinner. I was born many years after partition, and I can look back at the event with some detachment, I hope. My father could never do that. And that used to irritate me sometimes. But as I grew older, and now that he's long gone, I can understand the pain he feels. I very much regret the arguments that I had with him when I told him that he was a communal person. I think I'm a different man now. Thank you. Thank you, Shandipan, for the text.
Thank you for reading that. I think that was very moving and very powerful. Sandipan, thank you for enabling that text to be read. I'm very glad that I was searching the net and I came across it. And I'm very glad that you are here to listen to your cousin reading that very poignant personal narrative of a difficult situation and trauma. And as you can see, for those of you in Majha House who are familiar with the Punjab, who live in the Punjab, there is a very different partition that took place. There was violence, there was a lot of horror and terror and trauma, but the stories are different and the histories are different, as both Vinayak and Inakshi and Shaleen, as Amrita have shown. Now, I know that we are running out of time, and I want to just hand it back to Guru Pratap to see if there is time for a question or two or a comment or two. And I'd like to really appreciate my panel for the amazing sharing that they have done and the learning that we have received. Guru Pratap, over to you. No, you're frozen. I mean, Preeti, you want to take over? I think he's blocked. Something's happened.
No, he should be there.
No, there's a connection with his phone, a problem with his connection, I think. Okay. Why don't you come in now?
Yeah, I mean, I was planning to just stay out of it, but I really enjoyed the session, I must say, because of course it's Vinayak, I mean, that was fantastic. I wish you were first because you really laid out the entire history and then we could have gone on to everything else. I think it was wonderful because we got in so many different perspectives and different ways of looking at, as you said, the little known stories of the Northeast. I feel really happy and privileged that I've traveled there so much and that I know a little bit now, a little more than other Punjabis perhaps. But yeah, it's really been a very, very interesting session, and thank you everybody for it. There have been some questions, and I think Abhijit still has his hand raised, so maybe we should ask him to, I think he has a question. There were a couple of other questions that I could see on chat, so I'll go back and look at those, but maybe Abhijit can be the first person to ask. Munish, if you will unmute him and ask him. Abhijit.
Hello.
Okay, there you are, Guru Pratap.
Yeah, my connection just broke down. I don't know what happened.
Okay, you carry on now. I was asking Abhijit if he has a question. So if he does, yes. Otherwise, you carry on.
Okay. So the problem is that now I am not able to see the chat because my laptop is down because of the network thing. So I have to open the house now for questions. So if there are any questions that you would like to ask the audience, the speakers, please.
Abhijit, it doesn't seem to be around. Or maybe he's left now. I don't know.
Hello.
Abhijit?
Sudeep had this hand up.
And Rakhi, you wanted to say something also.
I just had a comment.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all it was absolutely fantastic. This is the first time I've actually heard a sort of consortium of people talking about the Eastern Partition in a general sense. I'm not talking about the academia. I've had the privilege of living in Bangladesh for 5 years, from 1999 to 2004. And it was a life-changing experience. My father was born in Faridpur. My dadu comes from Sylhet. They lived in Shillong. So there's a lot of linkages there, which only was transmitted to me through stories and so on, because I'm born and brought up as a Provashi Bangali in Chittaranjan Park, from where I'm speaking, in Delhi. And what struck me was, even at such a late time, as late as 1999 to 2004, when I was actively there, the cracks and the fissures and the traumas of partition haven't gone away. For instance, initially when I rented a house, I remember our house was stoned, not in the torched, but stoned by people because they thought we were Indians, and they are very, very anti-Indians at the surface level. When I got to know some people there and spoke Bangla, they said, okay, thik ache. And of course I had to play the trump card of Baba Faridpur theke, mane Faridpure chele, oh, thik ache, bongo pola. But I felt as an Indian, I don't need that veneer of protection, because it ought not to be that way. So the fissures are very, very strong. I remember I took my parents back to Dhaka. When we went to Faridpur, my father found the one and only tap in the village where they used to get the water. That was also sort of doubled up as the cricket wicket. So, and there were tears in his eyes. But the schism that still exists is astonishing. A simple example was when you watch an India-Pakistan cricket match, all the Bangladeshis support Pakistan. So even their recent historical memory is so short. I mean, 1971, the Indians fought for the independence of Bangladesh. Various things episodes, having lived there for 5 years, you really see it in a different light altogether, completely uncharted. Someone was talking about Surahwardi. I mean, there was a fight. I remember there was a literature conference. I was there, and people were fighting over whether Surahwardi should be an Indian poet or a Bangladeshi poet. As if, for God's sakes, he's writing about Bengal. So why don't we concentrate on the poetry? So even now, the cracks and the fissures are very, very deep.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Sudeep. I think we're really out of time. And do we have time for one quick question and a quick answer? If there is a question, is there anybody with a question? Can I ask as the moderator? If anybody has a question, please ask it. And we will ask whoever you ask it of to make a quick answer.
I believe there was a question about the Mondals. Why did the Mondals have to leave? Someone was talking about that. Do you see somewhere in the chat?
Yeah. I asked for that. It means Mondal is the one who had decided to stay on in Pakistan. But it was surprised, means I didn't know that he shifted back to India in 1950. What was the reason? I wanted to understand.
Okay. So your question is addressed to?
I guess it would be to the historian, Vinayak.
Yeah, correct, sir.
Sanjata, may I? When partition took place, even during the Sylhet referendum, Jogen Mondal actually campaigned against retention of Sylhet in India. So he was in favor of partition. But having said that, between 1947 and 1950, he was occupying positions. He was the law minister, he was the labor minister. And incidentally, when he went off for a conference, he did not go back to Pakistan. He actually flew to India and sent in his resignation letter from India to Pakistan. And in his resignation letter, Jogen Mondal actually starts giving us vivid details about what actually happens in East Pakistan between 1947 and 1950, and why people, including those what he called the depressed classes, had to actually leave. Just one small point here, that while post-partition, the Bhadralok and the affluent class essentially came over to India because they had some kind of a living space in India. For example, in Sylhet, for example, a lot of people had houses in Shillong. I'm talking about the middle class. I'm talking about the affluent, government servants. They had some kind of a house in some part of India, some part of Northeast India. It could be Guwahati, it could be Shillong, it could be Silchar, it could be Karimganj. But for the depressed classes, as he called them, what we understand as Dalits, they were then left and they were actually bearing the brunt of communal antagonism and hatred. And this is what is vividly described in Jogen Mondal's resignation letter sent to Pakistan from India in 1950.
Thank you. Before my hosts at Majha House shut me down and lock us all out, I have a little anecdote from a bar in Shillong. I was at the Pinewood Hotel some years ago, having a drink with the owner of the Shillong Times, the one and only Manas Chaudhary. And I heard somebody at a table saying, getting up and saying, does anybody here know the address of the Paradise restaurant in Guwahati? So we all turned to him and said, yes, we know. Who are you? He turned out to be the former foreign secretary of Bangladesh, who was on a trip to Shillong because he had studied in St. Edmunds, which is also the place where I studied. And I think Samrat and others have also good connections with Edmunds. And so we were able to have this wonderful chat. It just shows you a little town in the hills is a meeting place for history. It's a place where history was made and it's still being made. And we have a historian who's also sitting there and talking to us with his wonderfully nuanced reflections on the times past and times present. So thank you all very much. I hand it back to Gur Pratap and Preeti for closing remarks, but I want to thank my panel and the participants who are as much part of the panel as anyone of those who spoke. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Joy. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all of you, our speakers and our audience, for joining us today for this wonderful, wonderful session. I lost my connection due to some problem and I could not thank you all enough or praise you all enough, and now I am out of time. But I was just asking you that hopefully you have read the chats that we have been having during the session, and you can have a look at all the comments and interactions that people are sharing with you. And I'm sure from their comments and observations that they had a wonderful time today, as with thee. And I thank you all for joining us today. And before we sign off, I would like to share with you the program that we have charted out for the month of September. Starting from tomorrow itself, that is almost the last day of August, we have another musical event which is titled Lockdown Live, and we have it on Facebook, the Majha House Facebook page at 5:30 in the evening. So if you are free and you would like to hear some Punjabi folk music and Sufi music, please do join us on the Majha House Facebook page at 5:30 tomorrow. It will be a wonderful program. And as in August, so in September, we have a wonderful lineup of programs, and we are starting from the first Saturday that we have in September, which will be a program of reading short stories by our members, Majha House members, followed by an author interaction who will be bringing to us her book on Jennifer and child trafficking. And then we also have another writer coming in with writer is Anand Neelkanthan, and he will be launching his new book on this platform. And you can look forward. And we also have Sudeep, I think, joining us. Sudeep Sen is also joining us for a session next month. So it will be a wonderful lineup of programs all through the month, every Saturday. And on every Sunday, we'll have those musical programs. So please do join us, and we look forward to hosting you again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone joining in. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Very much.